What if RoboCop? The Thing and Akira weren't just movies, but threats that terrified governments. In the neon-soaked chaos of the 1980s, sci-fi films pushed boundaries so far, they sparked bans, edits, and underground legends. Why did these stories of mutants, machines, and dystopias scare officials more than monsters ever could? Stick around because some of the wildest films of the decade were locked away, yet their forbidden power only grew stronger. Cannibal Holocaust, 1980. Imagine walking into a theater expecting jungle adventure, and walking out shaken, convinced you just saw something too real. That was the experience audiences had with Cannibal Holocaust. Though it straddled horror and science fiction with its found footage premise of explorers encountering tribes in the Amazon, the movie's realism was its curse. Authorities in Italy were so disturbed, they actually arrested director Ruggero Deodato, convinced he had staged real violence. He had to drag his actors into court just to prove they were alive. The controversy didn't stop there. More than 50 countries banned the film outright, from Australia to the United Kingdom. In the United States, theaters were only allowed to screen it after heavy edits. What rattled officials wasn't just the gore, it was the deeper question: how far will filmmakers go to create something shocking, and how far will audiences go to watch it? Bootleg copies spread fast, turning Cannibal Holocaust into a whispered legend among collectors. What was meant to be buried instead grew larger in myth, inspiring debates on censorship, morality, and the blurred line between fiction and reality. The movie may not sit comfortably in any single genre box, but its place in the sci-fi canon of controversy is locked in. Governments tried to silence it, but in doing so, they gave it immortality. Altered States, 1980. Now, picture this. A scientist so obsessed with unlocking human potential that he pushes his body into realms unknown. That's Altered States. Directed by Ken Russell, this film dove headfirst into hallucinatory visuals, rapid mutations, and visions that looked like they were lifted from another dimension. For mainstream audiences, it was a head trip. For censors, it was too much. In several countries, scenes had to be cut or trimmed, not only for the intense transformations, but also for the imagery that seemed to mock sacred ideas and question the limits of science. Officials worried it was the kind of film that could influence unstable minds. The studio faced a war with ratings boards battling to keep the director's vision intact. Despite the cuts, Altered States became a cult classic. Its exploration of evolution, identity, and the dangerous thirst for knowledge set it apart from standard monster flicks. The visual effects were groundbreaking for their time, blending practical makeup with surreal, dreamlike sequences that audiences couldn't forget, even if they wanted to. Ironically, the more censors tried to slice it down, the more attention it received. The controversy only made it feel more dangerous, more forbidden. And for fans of the bizarre, that was exactly the draw. Altered States didn't just challenge the boundaries of science fiction. It challenged what a mainstream audience could handle in a single sitting. Mad Max 2, The Road Warrior, 1981. Post-apocalyptic wastelands, leather-clad gangs, cars turned into rolling machines of destruction. The Road Warrior, better known as Mad Max 2, roared onto screens with such intensity that some countries wanted no part of it. In New Zealand, the film was banned outright, judged as too violent and nihilistic for audiences. In Sweden, entire sequences of carnage were trimmed away before it could be shown. Why such fear? Because this wasn't just an action flick. Director George Miller painted a vision of a society collapsed, where law and order meant nothing, and survival was bought with gasoline and grit. For nations already wrestling with fears of rising crime and social unrest, the world of Mad Max felt less like fantasy and more like a warning. The irony? Every ban only fueled the legend. Fans across Europe hunted down imported VHS copies. Discussions popped up in underground film circles about the forbidden cut of Mad Max 2. And when The Road Warrior finally gained global traction, it became a blueprint for every wasteland epic that followed, from comic books to video games. Far from being forgotten, censorship gave it sharper teeth. The Road Warrior stands as proof that sometimes the most frightening thing about a movie isn't the action, it's the mirror it holds up, showing how fragile civilization really is. Scanners, 1981. One image defined Scanners, a man's head exploding in a boardroom. For audiences, it was shocking. for censors, it was unacceptable. David Cronenberg's tale of psychic warfare pushed boundaries with practical effects so convincing that even jaded viewers squirmed in their seats. In the United Kingdom, ratings boards insisted on heavy cuts before allowing a release. In Germany, versions aired missing entire sequences. The concern wasn't just about the gore, but the underlying theme: humans as weapons of the mind capable of unseen destruction. It was a concept that felt dangerous in a Cold War world already on edge about invisible threats. Yet, for all the controversy, Scanners became iconic. Cronenberg's direction turned a low-budget Canadian production into an international talking point. The special effects done with balloons, gelatin, and hidden explosives were groundbreaking. They didn't look like tricks. They looked terrifyingly real. What censors didn't realize is that every cut only made fans hungrier to see what they were missing. Scanners spawned sequels, parodies, and became a cornerstone of Cronenberg's reputation as the master of body horror. The film's message was clear: the human mind is a battlefield scarier than any explosion, and sometimes the most haunting scenes are the ones someone tried to erase. The Evil Dead, 1981. At first glance, The Evil Dead seems more horror than sci-fi, but its strange lore, interdimensional forces, and unrelenting energy earned it a place in both camps. What really cemented its legacy, though, was its brutal treatment by censors. In the United Kingdom, it landed squarely on the infamous Video Nasty list, meaning it was banned from shelves and demonized in the press. Authorities claimed it was far too graphic for home viewing, particularly in an era when VHS tapes were making movies more accessible than ever. Newspapers ran panicked stories about young viewers being corrupted, fueling the backlash even more. The ban transformed The Evil Dead from a scrappy indie into an underground legend. Director Sam Raimi's low-budget ingenuity didn't help calm fears. With homemade effects, relentless camera tricks, and a breakneck pace, the movie felt chaotic, almost lawless. Censors argued that its sheer intensity made it more dangerous than polished Hollywood horror. But fans saw it differently. They saw bold creativity unleashed. The ban only amplified that reputation. Importers smuggled copies across borders. Collectors traded bootleg tapes like contraband. By the time the sequels arrived, The Evil Dead had already carved its place in cult history. What censors thought they were protecting audiences from became the very thing that drew them in. Sometimes the forbidden fruit really is the sweetest. The Thing, 1982. Snow, silence, and something lurking beneath the ice. John Carpenter's The Thing was supposed to be the next great sci-fi horror after Alien. Instead, it was treated like a contagion. When it premiered in 1982, critics tore it apart, and censors in Europe didn't hold back either. Some countries restricted or trimmed the film, calling its grotesque imagery unacceptable. Audiences weren't prepared for creatures that split, crawl, and morph with stomach-turning realism. Carpenter's vision of paranoia in a frozen outpost wasn't just about monsters. It was about trust, or the lack of it. What happens when you can't tell who's human and who's already infected? That dread struck too close to home during a Cold War decade marked by suspicion and secrecy. The special effects by Rob Bottin pushed cinema into a new era of body horror. Melting faces, twisting limbs, and stomachs that opened into jaws weren't just gross, they were revolutionary. But those same effects became the justification for bans and heavy edits abroad. For officials, it wasn't just about protecting audiences. It was about shutting down a film that looked too real. Ironically, the movie's failure at the box office, partly fueled by censorship, set it up for a massive comeback. On VHS and later DVD, The Thing clawed back its reputation, growing into one of the most influential sci-fi horrors ever made. In the end, censors may have tried to smother its fire, but they only froze it long enough for fans to rediscover it and declare it a masterpiece. Videodrome, 1983. Now, here's a movie that felt more like a warning than entertainment. Videodrome, directed by David Cronenberg, asked a chilling question. What happens when the media you consume consumes you back? Its surreal blend of technology hallucination and grotesque transformation sent shockwaves through the early 80s. Censors weren't amused. South Korea banned it entirely. Across Europe, governments demanded cuts to tone down its disturbing imagery. In the United States, it faced near X ratings before edits softened the blow. Officials feared that audiences might take its vision of technology's power too seriously. Ironically, the film predicted a future where screens would dominate daily life, and wasn't that exactly what was starting to happen? Cronenberg leaned on practical effects that turned television screens into living flesh, VHS tapes into pulsating objects, and human bodies into grotesque hybrids with machines. It wasn't just horror for shock's sake. It was commentary on addiction control and the danger of losing yourself in the glow of media. The bans only added fuel to its fire. Fans whispered about the uncut version, and bootleg tapes became prized collectibles. Over time, Videodrome's eerie catchphrase, "Long live the new flesh," became a cultural touchstone. The very film that censors tried to bury became proof that sci-fi could be prophetic. And decades later, it still feels more relevant than ever. Firestarter, 1984. What happens when a child becomes the most dangerous force in the room? Firestarter, adapted from Stephen King's novel, introduced audiences to a young girl with pyrokinetic powers hunted by a secret government agency. It blended the sci-fi fascination with experiments and psychic powers with a deeply personal story of survival. But not everyone was ready to see that. In parts of Asia, Firestarter was slapped with heavy restrictions. Officials claimed its storyline government testing on children and institutions using humans as lab subjects was too controversial. In a decade defined by growing mistrust of authority, the movie's premise struck a nerve. Censors often trimmed sequences of the girl, unleashing her full fury, worried that it glamorized chaos. But those cuts missed the point. The movie wasn't about spectacle. It was about fear. What would a government do if it created something it couldn't control? What would a child do if she realized her power outweighed everyone around her? Though not as financially successful as other King adaptations, Firestarter grew into a cult film precisely because of its controversy. The bans and edits made it seem more dangerous than it really was, and that reputation gave it lasting power. Looking back, it's not the flames that still burn, it's the idea of authority gone too far. Dune, 1984, grandiose, messy, ambitious beyond measure. David Lynch's Dune was unlike anything sci-fi had seen before, yet this very ambition made it a target for censors worldwide. The film, packed with themes of religious symbolism, political upheaval, and ecological collapse, was considered too complex and too risky. In several countries, distributors cut entire sections, reducing its runtime and watering down its heavy themes. The problem wasn't just its sprawling narrative, it was its subtext. Here was a movie about empires exploiting planets, powerful leaders manipulating faith, and oppressed people rising against their rulers. For some governments, that was too on the nose. Censorship became a way to tame a story that felt like thinly veiled social critique. Audiences were left divided. Some walked out confused by the chopped-up versions, while others whispered that the uncut Dune was a hidden masterpiece. Over time, that underground buzz grew, and fans began trading longer cuts pieced together from TV versions and imports. Though Lynch himself disowned the studio's final cut, Dune's censored past only added to its legend. It became more than a film. It became a puzzle, with fans hunting down every missing piece. Today, the once condemned project is seen as a flawed gem, its influence stretching far beyond its original release. Sometimes the most dangerous stories are the ones too big to fit neatly into a safe box. Brazil, 1985. What happens when a movie is so rebellious that even its own studio tries to bury it? Brazil, directed by Terry Gilliam, was one of the boldest dystopian visions of the 80s. Imagine Orwell's 1984, mixed with dark comedy, endless bureaucracy, and surreal visuals. It was unlike anything else in theaters, and that scared the very people who paid to make it. In the United States, Universal Pictures fought Gilliam tooth and nail, refusing to release his original cut. Executives wanted a shorter, happier version, stripped of its bleak ending. Gilliam went public, waging a very real battle with the studio, and even taking out a full-page ad asking why audiences were being denied his vision. The controversy made headlines. Internationally, some countries censored or delayed the release, worried about the film's unflinching critique of authority, government control, and blind obedience. Gilliam's movie wasn't just entertainment, it was a mirror. And not everyone wanted to see what was staring back. Despite all the roadblocks Brazil endured, Fans and critics rallied behind Gilliam, and the original version eventually made it to audiences, instantly becoming a cult classic. The censorship didn't erase it, it elevated it. Today, Brazil is hailed as one of the sharpest satires of the 20th century. The film's message is timeless. Sometimes the scariest futures aren't the ones with monsters, but the ones where the system itself becomes the villain. Reanimator, 1985. If you thought Frankenstein was unsettling, imagine it reimagined with a punk rock edge for the 1980s. That was Reanimator Stuart Gordon's cult, hit that blended science fiction and horror into something too outrageous for many censors to stomach. The story followed a medical student experimenting with a serum that could bring the dead back to life. But what shocked audiences wasn't the concept, it was how far the film was willing to push it. In Australia, Reanimator was banned completely. The ratings board declared it far too graphic and extreme for public viewing. Across Europe, different edits popped up with whole sequences removed to make it more acceptable. Even in the United States, the unrated cut was whispered about like a forbidden treasure, circulating among fans who craved the full version. The controversy turned Reanimator into a cult sensation. College students passed VHS copies like Contraband and midnight screenings, drew crowds eager to see what officials didn't want them to. The humor, the outrageous practical effects, and the sheer audacity made it a standout in a decade already filled with shocking films. Instead of burying it, censorship gave Reanimator an edge. It became a test of bravery. Could you handle what was deemed too much? Decades later, the film is celebrated as one of the boldest sci-fi horror hybrids of its era. What officials tried to erase only made fans want it more. From Beyond, 1986. Stuart Gordon didn't stop with Reanimator. He doubled down with From Beyond, a film so strange and so daring that it immediately landed in the crosshairs of censors. The plot centered on a machine that stimulated the pineal gland, allowing people to see into another dimension. Sounds like pure sci-fi wonder, right? Except what came through that gateway was grotesque, monstrous, and unforgettable. Authorities in the United Kingdom weren't having it. The movie was caught up in the infamous video nasty panic, where dozens of films were seized or banned for their disturbing content. In the United States, ratings boards forced Gordon to trim scenes repeatedly before they would grant it an R rating. Why the panic? Because From Beyond wasn't subtle. It used groundbreaking practical effects to show bodies morphing, stretching, and twisting into alien horrors. The imagery was nightmarish surreal and unlike anything audiences had seen before. But, just like Reanimator, the bans backfired. Horror and sci-fi fans hunted down uncut versions, spreading its reputation through word of mouth. The film became a badge of honor. In underground circles, a movie you had to track down to fully experience. Today, From Beyond is seen as a cult classic, its legacy built as much on its censorship battles as its creativity. RoboCop, 1987. Dead or alive, you're coming with me. RoboCop wasn't just a sci-fi action film, it was a razor-sharp satire dressed in explosions and one-liners. Paul Verhoeven's vision of a cyborg cop cleaning up a corrupt Detroit was both thrilling and biting, skewering corporate greed and dehumanization. But censors didn't see the wit. They saw the violence. When it first landed in 1987, the Motion Picture Association of America nearly slapped it with an X rating. Whole sequences like the infamous boardroom shooting and a sadistic gang assault had to be trimmed down before release. Even after the cuts, RoboCop was one of the most violent mainstream films of the decade. Internationally, the scissors came out again. Different countries removed chunks of gore, toning down the intensity. But here's the irony. Verhoeven wasn't celebrating the violence. He was mocking it, holding up a mirror to a society where human life was treated like a disposable commodity. The censorship only made fans hungrier for the full version. The uncut RoboCop became a prize VHS, proving that satire could be as dangerous as any explosion. Today, the film is remembered not just as an action spectacle, but as one of the smartest sci-fi critiques of the 80s. Governments tried to neuter it, but they only sharpened its bite. Akira, 1988. When Akira exploded onto the scene in 1988, it wasn't just an animated film. It was a revolution. Katsuhiro Otomo's cyberpunk vision of post-apocalyptic Tokyo biker gangs and psychic powers stunned audiences with its sheer scale and detail. But for some governments, it was too much to handle. Russia banned it outright, claiming the violent imagery could harm young viewers. Across Europe, screenings were cut, with some of the more graphic transformations removed. Even in the United States, early VHS releases trimmed sequences that ratings boards found too disturbing. What officials didn't realize was that every cut only fueled Akira's legend. Fans passed around bootlegs whispering about scenes too intense for mainstream release. The film's influence spread like wildfire, shaping everything from The Matrix to Stranger Things. The true power of Akira wasn't just in its visuals, but in its themes. Government corruption, the abuse of science, youth rebellion. It was all wrapped up in a neon nightmare that felt prophetic. Censors thought they could contain it, but instead they helped cement Akira as one of the most important sci-fi films of all time. Society, 1989. On the surface, Society looked like another teen drama with a sci-fi twist. But by the time audiences reached its infamous finale, they realized they were watching something far stranger. Brian Yuzna's film unveiled a grotesque climax where the wealthy elite literally merged together in a surreal, slimy ritual. It was part satire, part body horror, and all nightmare fuel. Censors balked. Several countries banned it outright, unwilling to release something so bizarre and grotesque. In the United Kingdom, it was heavily edited before it could play in theaters. Officials claimed it was indecent and unacceptable for mainstream audiences. But, as always, censorship only boosted curiosity. Fans who managed to track down the uncut version were left shocked, and word of mouth turned Society into a cult hit. Critics later praised it as a sharp commentary on class divide hidden under outrageous sci-fi horror. The irony is that what once made it too controversial is exactly what gives it staying power today. Society dared to say the quiet part out loud that the ruling class feeds on everyone else, and it used sci-fi grotesquerie to drive the point home. The bands may have tried to silence it, but they only guaranteed its place as one of the most unforgettable films of the 80s. Censors tried to bury these films, but all they did was make them legends. The Thing, RoboCop, and Akira movies once locked away now stand taller because someone feared their power. Which band sci-fi gem from the 80s blew your mind the most? Let me know in the comments. Hit that like button and subscribe for more forbidden stories from cinema's wild side. Remember, the movies they tried to erase are often the ones that never die.